So we are in part 4 of our sermon series, If Then, which is digging into the idea of the nature of the relationship between us and God. And it's very important that we get this right, because if we think a certain thing about God, then we are very likely to act in a particular way in response. And if we think something about God and act in that way, acting in that way shapes who we become, impacts how we relate to other people, and ultimately determines how the world will end up. If we think something different about God, we will act a different way, interact differently with people, and the world will end up in a different direction. So it is very important that we get this right. Now, in week 1, we heard from Isaiah, and Isaiah in chapter 58, and God through Isaiah said, "Tell the people, make them listen, shout to the people about their rebellion." Their rebellion, meaning they were doing something, they were way off, right? They were doing things that were exactly the opposite, not a little off, but exactly the opposite of what God wanted them to do. And were they doing bunches of evil things? Not necessarily. It's just that they were focused on themselves. They were doing rituals and things that were just focused on themselves. And God said, if you're just focused on yourself, I can't hear you. Not because I'm not trying to hear you, but because what you are saying has no meaning and it's all inside of you and it can't get out from inside of you to get to me. I can't help you if you're just focused on yourself. Where I need you focused is on other people. I need you focused on helping the people who are most in need. The people who are most in need. And it's summed up like this. If you're just looking in the mirror and focusing on yourself, God is unimpressed. Because that is not what the faith is about. That's not what God asks us to do. It's not what God asks us for the faith to be about. We are supposed to be looking for other people who are hurting and help them. And when we do that, God promises that the light that God has embedded inside us will begin to grow brighter and brighter and brighter, and that God will hear us when we call out in pain to help those other people. And God will show up and say, I hear you, and I am with you, and will be in front of you and behind you and surround you with light, and things will go much better. Then the next week, we had the If God Had Dinosaur Arms. Right? If God had dinosaur arms. And this was from Isaiah 59, where it starts out with God's arms are not too short. And we talked about how the people at the time were abusing the legal system to hurt the oppressed. And this was one of the biggest offenses you could do in the world at that time, because the legal system was the last line of defense for the oppressed people from the powerful people. Right? The powerful people had all the power, but the legal system was supposed to kind of help balance the scales a little bit. But these people were abusing the legal system, and the people who could have done something about it weren't doing anything about it. And so what was happening is the people were like, God, why are things going so poorly? Well, it's like, because you're hurting people. And so you're creating your own pain in this world. And they're like, well, help us. And they were acting like they were doing all this wonderful stuff and stretching their arms all the way to the sky, and God had little dinosaur arms that wouldn't reach all the way back there. And we talked about how do we end up like that? Because God said, I need to come down there and fix this, since you won't, because nobody will do anything about it. God didn't say only 1 or 2 people will do something. God said nobody will do anything about it. And if nobody does anything about it, God will come down and do something about it. And the fact is, that may sound to you like that's a good thing. That is not a good thing. That is not a good thing. Because if God has to fix it, that means we failed. If God has to fix it, it means we failed. A good friend of mine, Chip, had a t-shirt I told you about last week. It said, "Don't make me come down there, God." Right? So we're talking about we need to be working this ourselves. Next, and if we do that, God will show up and help us do that work. We will not be alone, but we can't just wait. We don't just want to wait for God to fix it. Then, last week, we talked about Moses and how Moses was doing his closing argument right before he handed over power to Joshua, right before he died, and said, everybody, I need you to listen to me very carefully. All these commandments and different things I've given to you, you need to follow them. Because you have a choice here, to follow them and live, or not follow them and die. And it didn't mean like a lightning strike was going to come down and kill them. It meant that if you follow the path that God gives you, you're going to have a more fulfilling, more joyful, more successful life. If you don't, that you're going to more likely live a life of living death that isn't fulfilled no matter what you try to fill it with. That if you follow this way, you will live. If you do not follow this way, you will die. And we talked about how some people will say, well, that's way too hard. We can't follow all these commandments. We can't do all this kind of stuff. And we saw a passage that said, people are saying it's too hard. And God's like, no, it's not. God said, these commandments are not too hard for you. It is a line that is repeated in Scripture. What I'm asking you to do is not too hard. If you choose not to do it, just accept you're unwilling to do it and you're making a choice. And when we make this choice, we recognize that what we're being asked to do is follow what's called the narrow way, right? The narrow way of Jesus. And if we walk on this narrow way, we are headed towards the light and doing well. But a lot of times what we want to do, and this is something from last week, which I put big red X's through saying, don't do this. What we like to do is walk on the wide highway of life. Right? We're walking on the wide highway and say, I'm not ready to commit to the narrow way. I'm going to walk the way I want to, but I'm going to keep my hands on the narrow way so I can do both. But what God and Jesus both say is you have to make a choice. Because as you continue to walk on this, you might be able to do it for a little while. But as you keep walking down that road, that highway of the world, it gets harder and harder and harder to hold on. You start stretching and walking away from that narrow way. This guy's sweating here, right? Trying to hold on to it. And eventually you walk so far away that you can no longer hold on to that narrow way. And it is very difficult to get back on once you are really far away from it. So we're asked to focus on this idea that we need to choose, to really put ourselves. And then we have the scripture from this week, from Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 7. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. The reason they had to say the Lord alone is because back then, people believed in all kinds of different gods, and they had to make a choice about which God they were going to follow. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. But some people say, we don't have to listen to that. Jesus changed all that. Well, then we went to Mark, and we heard that the scribes were asking Jesus, what's the most important commandment to follow? And Jesus answered, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This stuff does not go away with Jesus. But this idea of putting all of ourselves in can be kind of an interesting one to try to figure out what exactly that means, to put our whole selves into something like that. Because sometimes we'll be like the person who's walking along, it's like, all right, I'll put one arm in on the narrow way, and it's like, oh, that feels strange, and it buzzes, and so we pull it out. We're like, that kind of doesn't feel great. We'll say, all right, we'll keep trying because it doesn't feel normal. Put our hand in. And I'll say, all right, that's all right. So let me put another hand in. I put another hand in, and then that kind of feels a little too much, so I take it out and kind of like shake it out. I'm like, all right, that's all right. Then maybe put my foot in. And that starts to feel comfortable because that's a little bit too much. So we take the foot out. I'm like, ugh. And then eventually we try and get enough there, and we put our whole selves in, right? And then that feels like too much. So we jump out. We're like, ugh. And then we try, okay, we're going to like put our whole selves in. And it kind of shakes us up, right? Kind of shakes us up if we do that. But that's what it's all about, right? Is anybody tracking this yet? Anybody tracking this yet? Right? Okay, so I thought to myself, what kind of object lesson could we do to get ourselves to really feel and cement this into what this means? So would my volunteers please come up, or anybody who doesn't know what's going on and would like to come up front, and everybody else up, embody your spirit. Everybody else up, embody your spirit. If you know this song, it's going to be very easy. If you don't, just follow along. You will pick it up very quickly. I know I got a couple more people coming up. Anybody else is welcome to come on up, or you can do it from right there. Dan, kick it off. Oh, yeah, that's how to do it. You put your right hand in, you put your right hand out, you put your right hand in, and you shake it all about. You do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around. That's what it's all about. You put your left hand in, you put your left hand out, you put your left hand. Amen.